law school. I've been scheduled for an afternoon class all semester, so I'm used to this time zone, and I appreciate that everyone's still here and awake, and I try to keep things hopping so that you won't fall asleep. So just to make our panel very entertaining, we're going to be kind of like Sound of Music, where someone sings their so long farewell and then they disappear because they have to go catch a flight. So they're not leaving because they don't like you. And we appreciate that all of you are trying to stay, but we're going to have a few of the panelists sort of spin off. And so that's what they're doing. But the rest of us are going to stay till the bitter end and answer your questions. So this is the order. We're talking about siting energy facilities. So we're talking about large-scale siting, but we're also talking about distributed generation siting. And I pretty much put it in the order that people had to leave and peel off. So this is what the panelists are up here. I also have done a lot of work on distributed generation siting. I have a chapter in a forthcoming book called Deep Decarbonization. So that's on SSRN. Oop. Uh-oh, not. All right. And I just want to put that up there. And just for, I'm going to put one other plug in here because all of you are interested in energy. The University of Denver is doing a program on November 17th on decarbonization in a post-Paris world. So we're going to be, that's a free program from 1 to 4:30, well, 1 to 6 if you stay for food. So I just wanted to have people aware of that program as well. But I'm going to go ahead and we'll put up the slides for Amy to start on hers, and then I can answer some questions about distributed if people have those at the end. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you. I'm actually going to stand up here so that I can not have to turn around all the time. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. I definitely second all the thanks. This has been just an amazing day. Those of you who've made it through the whole thing, it's just been a wonderful, refreshing perspective on energy. I think many of us probably attend a lot of conferences, but I really appreciate the efforts you have taken. So on our panel, we were trying to distinguish and differentiate what we're all going to talk about to make sure it's still exciting and new and relevant. Now, it ended up that nobody had really been talking about siting of distributed resources, so that's the one I took. What I'm going to try to do today is talk you through distributed siting defined, and then drawing upon a paper that I wrote. It's called Distributed Reliability, that, yes, was published here at the University of Colorado Law Review. Ah, what a good choice they made. And so talking about the challenges between breaking out the separation and control of these resources, and thinking about how this raises unique challenges, and I'll explain that a little bit more. And then potential solutions to this, because I always think we have to at least put a few with question marks on there to provoke some discussion. So we'll go quickly through these, because I think if you've been listening to any of this, you should already know what DERs are. But distributed energy resources. And so it can include things much broader than just solar PV on your rooftop and energy storage. Demand response and energy efficiency, it's defined differently depending on who you talk to, but FERC's definition includes them, so do I. So we, of course, always think about, oh, well, yes, putting solar on your rooftop, but don't forget we also have all the huge corporate folks who are putting solar on. Those are also distributed resources. We also have distributed energy storage. You've seen pieces of these over the course of today. But the top one here is the sort of traditional batteries we're talking about. Flywheels. The one here on the bottom right is thermal ice storage. And of course, this is the one you're probably most familiar with, Tesla's Powerwall. Yeah? So also all forms of distributed storage. Where there's a great DOE global energy storage database that you can go, and when you sort it by customer-owned storage, we have 278 projects across the country. I have some issues with the completeness of this DOE global storage database because I'm not sure how they get the data, and I'm still convinced it's self-reporting because I know, for instance, that I should have, I guess, introduced myself. I presumed you saw it, but I am a law professor at the University of Florida, but I happen to live in Albuquerque. And so in Albuquerque, I go to a food bank with my children, and guess what they're telling me? They've installed this huge solar installation. They take me up on the roof, and they say, look at our batteries. And they're not in this global database. So, right? So I know already there's some issues there. But I did at least pull up Colorado for you. And you have 11 projects here, mostly in the military Fort Collins area. None in Boulder. How sad. And if you don't know, we have our first energy storage mandates across the country. California was the first to have this, and it is a 1.3 gigawatt requirement. They are operating similarly to renewable portfolio standards. If you know what those are, there is an obligation on the utility to procure a certain amount of their generation from renewable resources. And here there's an obligation on the big three utilities in California. There they are, Southern California, PG&E, and San Diego Gas and Electric. And they have targets for 2020. They must procure a certain amount of energy storage. But for our purposes here, I just want you to see they also have divided it into there must be some customer-owned storage. So again, just this push towards distributed resources is not going away, which I think you already have that point. And then you've all probably seen this, right? If you try to search for the location of electric vehicle chargers, they're everywhere. So distributed resources as opposed to centralized resources. Because by this move towards more distributed resources, it creates challenges. We heard nicely, Carla this morning was telling us about sort of centralized siting challenges. There's a formal permitting process involved, and we often have large site control obstacles. It's very hard to get control over a huge plot of land to develop some sort of a large centralized facility. Think about the Endangered Species Act. You might trigger NEPA, right? We actually have issues with abandoned property and mineral rights that we can't figure out, can't clear title sufficiently. So it's a much longer process, and I think we had questions yesterday or this morning even, right, about transmission lines and how long the siting processes can take. So big centralized projects sort of fit into that camp, as opposed to decentralized siting is the opposite, right? A very limited permitting process. How many of you in here have solar panels on your home? Yes, some, right? It was hopefully pretty easy, at least easy compared to if you were trying to site a large power plant, yes? And so you also have your autonomy on your own property, so you don't have to go through a lot of those site control issues. That, I think, results in upside-down challenges and new ones for us that we're not quite prepared to deal with. So the first one is that when you're in centralized, you have the complicated process, but that means it's easy for grid operators and utilities to know what's out there, right? Because you go through this huge permitting process, everybody sort of knows there's a big new power plant going up, and so there's visibility. We also have coordinated siting based on demand, right? There's a request for proposal that's issued. Everybody realizes that there's a demand here, and so we're going to try to be siting some sort of a large power plant to meet that demand. Contrast that with decentralized siting. It's expedited siting process for the host. So where it's difficult for a large project to get sited, it's very easy here. But I think we're going to focus on this one. The contrast that this upside-down challenge where it's easy for grid operators to deal with big projects, it's much more difficult for them to have a good handle on distributed resources. Just obvious, right? They're all over the place, and we often don't have a great way to centralize sort of the information about not only where they're located, but how often they're being used. Because as you all know, you have complete flexibility. Even if you have solar panels, you could decide to turn them off at some point, and you don't have to always notify the utility. If you're going to be having some huge burst in electricity demand at your home, and that there's going to be less electricity flowing from your solar panels onto the grid for a certain period of time, you don't have to really notify them. And so that leads to lots of potential problems. Similarly, when we think about where they're located, I think this results in more piecemeal and haphazard siting because it's just a function of our own personal prerogative. Do we want to put something, here? Oh, we never used to have the ability to make a choice about putting storage at our own home or putting solar panels or something else. So I call these difficulties the separation of ownership and control. I looked at industrial organization literature, and it was very interesting to think about our utility models over time, because they all originated in the vertically integrated world, where it was like everything was produced here, I have full control, right? This was sort of the make model, make it yourself. And then we have the make and buy model, where when we had the advent of merchant generators. So now, right, utilities could look to somebody else and purchase electricity through them. And I call what we're doing now make and buy plus, because now it's not only going external, but it's going to external to somebody who's a customer as well. It's not just a third-party provider. So that leads to some potential problems. One, there can be asymmetrical information. That can mean that, right, the utility and the originator of this generation or storage services, this means that they might not be thinking on the same page about what's really out there. And this, I think, runs the risk of poor resource planning. We talked a lot about IRPs today and forecasting, and how is it that we're going to ensure accuracy, right? We started out that we were talking about such small amounts that it wasn't a big deal. But I don't know if you've been following in Nevada, the casinos that are defecting off the grid. So casinos are 7% of Nevada's total electricity demand. And MGM just said, we're out. It was an $87 million exit fee. And so they want to be running on solar, and they want to be off the grid. And so that's kind of a form of distributed generation, right? That they're going to be doing it themselves. Think of like a really big microgrid kind of an idea. And so, you know, when you have those folks coming off, you know, we definitely are worried. We're also worried that there could be threats to reliability of the grid if there's inaccurate information and bad forecasting, because as these amounts of distributed resources get larger, we may be able to feel the impacts on reliability of the grid. Similarly, distributed energy resources fall outside of NERC's reliability standards. So NERC's reliability standards are governed by the Federal Power Act, Section 215, which applies to the bulk grid. And states are in charge of the reliability of the distribution lines. So that can also raise problems with, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but if not, it's, I think, a very good one to just in one snapshot get the sense of the challenges for grid operators, because the yellow line is your solar. Okay, so this is, look at this huge peak during the day, which we've all been talking about. Okay, blue is your load. Green is your wind, and red is your net load. Okay, so what do all these squigglies mean? Hopefully you're seeing the inverse relationship, that we have, focus on the little pink boxes now, huge ramping demands on our grid operators. What does that mean? That means that right before solar kicks in, look at this. They have to go get somehow 6,300 megawatts in 2 hours are satisfied by solar. But then what happens when the sun goes down? Up here it is. And look at your load. Shoots up. They have a 13,500 megawatt ramp demand when the sun goes down. And what are they going to do to try to address this? So we're talking about distributed resources, and will they impact that at all? How exactly does that fit into the planning to try to address these? Does it mean that will storage be able to help, you know, smooth some of these curves? Well, it might depend on how much storage is out there, and is it available for any sort of public grid purposes, or is it only for private purposes? So my second difficulty is the limited coordination. This is my work home, Gainesville in Florida. So these are our electric vehicle chargers available. So take that as an example of distributed resources. And there's Gainesville. You see it? Well, guess what a lot of people in Gainesville do? They either all go to the ocean that way to St. Augustine, or they all come down here to Cedar Key to go fishing. So if you decide to drive your electric vehicle this way, you kind of enter no man's land. And so we have problems sometimes where, well, how wonderful if there would be a little more coordination so we could spread these out and maybe facilitate more of these distributed resources. Similarly, we may have divergent interests when we're dealing with distributed generation. Centralized resources are built to serve the utility. Those merchant plants are built to serve the utility. But distributed resources are built to serve the customer, right? We're generally putting them on because we want them. We want them for some personal reason. And so when those two things come into conflict, the house wins, right? Which means that what? Well, we're talking about using electric vehicles for storage for the grid. But that only works if you don't have to take your kid to the hospital, right? And so in the end, if push comes to shove and you've told the utility, yeah, you can use my vehicle as a charger, as a form of batteries, at some point, right, your priorities will probably trump. Same with net metering and trying to think about if they can rely on your extra output for, right, we often talk about net metering to allow for deferred grid investments. Well, what if all of a sudden folks who had been providing stop providing as much? Or your solar panels break down and you just don't have the money to replace them and they lose pieces of this. Similarly, folks who enroll in demand response programs like Internoc, there's no penalty if you don't meet your contract. So you're basically saying, yes, you can, turn off my non-essential components so that we can use that as a source of trying to bid those into the market. And yet, at the same time, when you look up on Internoc's page and it says, oh, well, what happens if I can't satisfy I can't turn everything off at that moment because there's a big wedding going on, right? We're usually enlisting like hotels and large commercial buildings to do this. Then there's no penalty. So again, right, the personal preferences may win. So what do you do with all these potential challenges? Well, one, maybe it's about increasing the visibility of these distributed devices. And how might we do that? Well, maybe disclosure requirements. Maybe you have to register everything with your utility and your grid operator. You do have to have an interconnection request to use solar rooftop, for instance. And so there's some information, but is that really getting transferred on to the right decision makers who handle grid operations? Maybe a national database of distributed siting locations, offer rebates that might require documentation, more of an incentive approach, like, oh, we'll give you money, and in return you have to fill out the sheet that tells us what's your capacity and how much you're using, and and smart meters, of course, can also help. Now there's a move towards production meters to help track this information. Similarly, maybe a second solution is to coordinate the siting between private and public actors. Some of you may be familiar with this idea of an independent distribution system operator that was set forth by one of our former FERC commissioners, kind of trying to model it on an RTO to help coordinate all of this. But maybe MOUs can help us in the meantime. So my home is there in New Mexico, and just recently, last week, 8 governors, including the governor of Colorado, we all got together and they signed a big MOU to coordinate on electric vehicle infrastructure. So, right, maybe more of these are needed. And sort of the last solution is just to align interests between the owners and the utilities. So more trying to think of ways to firm up those obligations, maybe through contractual mechanisms, the vehicle to grid idea for electric vehicles. If we're truly going to start allowing the utilities to tap into our electric vehicles to contribute to the public grid, maybe that contractual basis will mean that we have to forego taking our car to take our kid to the hospital, or what does that mean, right? Does that mean we're going to end up with more unintended consequences sometimes where we worry that people who buy electric vehicles are going to then buy a gas guzzler to make sure they have a backup? Similarly with net metering, and also allowing the aggregation of distributed energy resources to bid into wholesale markets. As you're probably aware, it's been a year now since FERC issued their NOPR on exactly that, trying to allow this to happen. So I'm throwing those out there for discussion, and thank you very much for your time.
So then she's going to go on.
Thank you. So I was planning to go at the very end and kind of have a wrap-up discussion, but I'm one of the Von Trapp family members who's leaving a little bit early. But it turns out that Amy actually teed up my presentation perfectly. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is a couple of orders up in terms of our strategic planning, not just to address distributed resources, not to address siting, but to really think about us thinking about this energy transition from a much bigger picture, focusing first of all on why the energy transition is happening and needs to happen, and it needs to happen a lot quicker than it is right now. So what this basically shows us is our carbon budget. And it is showing how much of our existing fossil fuel reserves we can burn in order to achieve certain temperature increase goals. So we've increased temperatures since pre-industrial era by about 1 degree Celsius, and we're obviously feeling the consequences of this. Most scientists think that we can't exceed or grow our temperatures by more than another degree, so no more than 2 degrees above background temperatures. Although more cautious scientists say that we can't increase our temperatures by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the bubbles on the left show us that we have about a 50% chance of achieving a 1.5 degree temperature increase if we burn about 1/7 of all the remaining fossil resources. And we don't have an 80% probability of achieving that temperature increase, although we're still on track, if we do a lot very quickly, to limit our temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. So this is serious. We have to be addressing the climate crisis, and we need to be addressing it very quickly. But in my view, mostly what we've been doing in terms of our policy making is addressing it through ad hoc policies, some of which are really good, some of which we're tooling with and working to improve, like Amy was mentioning, with distributed resources. But we're skipping over the really big questions. And the first really big question is, what is our end goal? And what science says is that developed countries need to reduce our emissions by somewhere between 80 and 95% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions by the middle of this century. And the only way we're going to get there is if we have 100% fossil fuel-free energy. So we have to be setting those goals. Ideally, our political leaders would be doing this. And once you set the goals, like anybody who's ever tried to achieve some big outcome in your own life, you set the target, and then you figure out how you're going to reach that target, and then you start ultimately implementing your strategy. So we need to be doing this, and it's very unlikely, in my view, that we are going to actually have our political leaders do this first step. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we then, in the advocacy community, in the academic community, in the renewable energy business community, and within those governments that are actually working hard on this, and we're going to hear from some folks from those governments, we need to be developing a blueprint that we're going to be implementing so that we're not just implementing policies on an ad hoc basis. Okay, so why I'm a little cynical about whether we're going to actually do this on a West-wide level. So this map just shows which states have actually enacted either greenhouse gas goals or mandates. Only California has actually mandated greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The states in blue have set greenhouse gas targets, and the states in white have not set any type of targets to reduce their greenhouse gases. Of those states that have a mandate, there's one. And right now, California is on track to meet its 2020 goals, but it just increased its mandates pretty substantially, and we don't know if it's ultimately going to be on track to meet those goals. It will need to decrease its emissions by about 5%, increase by 5% per year. So it's an additive, cumulative emissions decrease for it to meet its 2030 goals. Other states are not doing well with even their weaker goals. Colorado is probably the one that is more likely to ultimately achieve these goals, although we're not sure, they're very new. So the reason that Colorado isn't in the red warning sign is primarily because it is too soon to tell how it's going to ultimately do. Now, why aren't states doing this and meeting their goals? Well, the first is that many states haven't even created a regulatory structure or an agency coordinating structure that would actually require them to effectively collaborate with each other. So of the states that have targets, really only Washington and California have an integrated agency process in place. Colorado has some coordination between its different agencies. In Oregon, I'll put up a slide in a minute to show you what a mess Oregon is. And by the way, Oregon, where I'm from, this is the place that everybody's like, oh, Oregon, it's so great, it's so green, it's so progressive. Oregon is a cluster, which I'm going to explain in a minute. So this is our cluster. And what I want you to see at the very top is that Oregon has actually no agency responsible for achieving greenhouse gas goals or overseeing the way that the other agencies interact with each other. We do have something called the Oregon Global Warming Commission, a volunteer, stakeholder-based, unfunded, non-regulatory body that produces really great reports. They do great analysis, but there is no authority right now in the state over our overall climate goals. And then we have a ton of policies. Many states have a ton of policies. We have a ton of policies, most of which require multiple agencies to implement in different, often uncoordinated ways. But we are not on path to achieve our greenhouse gas emissions goals. And we're seen as one of the leading states in the country in terms of our ambition. And we're not on track because we enact a lot of policies without doing a lot of analysis of how they're going to work, or we enact a lot of market-based mechanisms that simultaneously include strategies that undermine those very markets because of the concern about the economic consequences. We're not alone, but I just want to highlight that as a region, we're not on track. Now, the reality is that we could get on track. We actually, the tools to assess how to achieve zero carbon energy, and by that I mean zero carbon electricity, heat, and transportation emissions, are available. This is just one example of one model from an institute at the University of California at Berkeley. They are measuring how you could dispatch electricity from different types of power sources to maintain reliability. And they're assuming that we would actually know where facilities are going to be sited. But as Amy indicated, we don't have coherent siting policies. People site where the resource is, they site where transmission capacity is available, and they site where they can, if available, get really good subsidies and rebates. So they're acting as wise economic actors, but they're not citing based on a broader strategic plan that the states have put together. So this is nothing new. This is how actually we tend to develop in humanity. And I just want to introduce you to, in my view, we're trying to build a major city, if you will. This is a huge project, a huge transition project. And, you know, if you grow on an ad hoc basis, this is basically Old Town Marrakesh from above. Have any of you been to Marrakesh? Did you get lost? Yeah, good. And it's beautiful, it's amazing, it's wonderful as a tourist, and it is a complete maze in these older cities. And it's actually hard in these older cities, therefore, to do commerce, to rebuild houses, to get medical care into these very clustered little old streets. And so we can see the example of bad planning. We're also probably familiar with both the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You might not be as familiar with Bologna, but these were towers built to illustrate the power of cities, and it turned out that they didn't really do any type of substrate testing, and so as they put weight in the towers leaned over. And this one in Bologna, you can't even go into these because they lean over so far. They're afraid that people in them might knock them over. Now, a lot of cities in Europe developed this way, and then over time, some city leaders made the decision that they were actually going to plan out a grid for their cities to modernize. And Paris is actually a really interesting example. This is Paris on the right. Paris had basically a Marrakesh type of old medieval quarter. And in the late 1700s, Paris realized it wasn't going to accommodate its growth and the type of city that they wanted to be. And so actually, they razed a lot of the parts of the city to put in this grid. It's controversial. It involved a lot of compensation. It involved a lot of planning. But Paris now, for anybody who's involved in urban design, Paris is the place that you look to actually plan out a grid for a place that already exists. It's easier when we're dealing on a blank slate, but we're not dealing on blank slates with either the energy sector or with city development as well. So can you develop better? Paris is an example of how you can. And I want to highlight a couple of areas in which we also have historically developed really well based on having some tools, but then also having the foresight to realize that A, with creative planning, but B, maybe moving without knowing all of the answers at the beginning can actually achieve a great deal of success. So first of all, I want to put the Pantheon up because the Pantheon was built during ancient Roman days. So it's around 2,500 years old now. And honestly, if people in Roman times, without any of the technology that we have, could build the Pantheon, everybody says if we could make it to the moon. I'm saying, come on, 2,500 years ago, they managed to build this building that is a perfect dome. We should surely be able to figure out how to transition our energy system. But the Duomo in Florence is also a really interesting example because the architects knew what they wanted and they had no idea how to build the dome. So they started building everything else. They had their blueprint, they started building everything else, and it took about 150 years before they held a contest and invited applications from people to figure out, how do we do this last part? They got an application from some random dude, basically, Brunelleschi, and he said, we're gonna do this double dome, and it was really new, and it totally worked. And so the point of all of this is that I'm not necessarily saying that this is going to be easy, and I'm not necessarily saying that we know exactly how to put all of the pieces in, but we have to start. And Denmark is a really great example. This is just one snapshot of a really great article that talks about how engineers in Denmark started to take all of the different pieces of their energy system, beginning with electricity. How do they move more wind into their system? Then they started to integrate heat. Then they started to integrate transportation. And without going into too many details, what this does is it provides us with Denmark's blueprint for how Denmark is going to get to 100% renewable wind, 100% renewable electricity, heat, and transportation by 2050, and 100% renewable electricity and heat by 2035. And Denmark, unlike all of our states that don't go all in and then develop a blueprint, is actually on track. So my goal is to have us start encouraging our political leaders to take the first step, but to have the rest of us presume that we're going to actually achieve this first step, the ambitious outcomes, and to start really figuring out the planning, the blueprint. What does our new energy system need to look like? And it's fine if we're going to continue to do smart policies and funding of some of the projects that we're working on, but we need a plan, because if we don't have a plan, we're going to end up in Marrakesh, which is lovely, but it's a hard place to get around, and we really need to start thinking about how we get to Paris. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tracy LeBeau. I'm a Senior Vice President for Western Area Power Administration. We're a part of the Department of Energy. And here I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about siting and financing and how a lot of these very, very large infrastructure projects are coming together these days throughout the West. I think the last time I was in this space, I was actually a moot court judge. So I'm sitting there, so I'm thinking, I have good memories. My in-house attorney, she came with me last night, and she said she had terrible memories of this room because this is where her Barbary classes were. So it was interesting to see how that came around. And I'll also say my other connection to CU is once upon a time when I was in law school, one of my professors was a very newly minted tenured professor named Jim Anaya. So I took a lot of international law classes with him while he was at University of Iowa. So I've known him for quite a while. So I was really happy to see that you guys landed in. Yeah, he's great. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about what if you don't know a lot about Western Area Power Administration, we are a federal entity, like I said. We essentially were set up to transmit the energy that's produced off of the 14 federal hydropower projects throughout a 15-state footprint. So throughout the West, throughout most of the Western states, we have transmission, some manner of transmission footprint. So we've got over 17,000 miles of high voltage transmission. I think we have, and Teresa, you can help me, I think we have over 700 customers now. So our customers are primarily like electric co-ops, municipal utilities, a lot of tribal governments, and a lot of other type of governmental entities. And so we are definitely more in the public power space, and that's so while we're not. We don't kind of have that retail touch that most utilities do, or the way that you usually think about utilities. We definitely are, obviously very impacted and pay a lot of attention to what's happening also in the retail space, although we are on the wholesale side. A couple of years ago, in 2009, when Congress passed the Recovery Act, one of the provisions that they included was a provision for us and for Bonneville Power Administration, but I'm not just going to talk about ours today. The provision was to provide us $3.25 billion in authority to provide loans. And the purpose of these loans were to, I think, the underlying congressional purpose was to really kind of get investment and equity off the sidelines and into infrastructure investments. And so, and one of the other statutory goals was to get folks starting to put real hard dollars into a lot of the pre-development of transmission that would facilitate the delivery of renewables. We don't have to do we don't have to work with 100% green lines, but we have to in some form or fashion facilitate the delivery of renewables throughout our 15-state footprint. Give you one example of kind of whether a project that we did early on was we provided the construction debt financing for a project called the Montana to Alberta line. So one terminus within somewhere in our 15-footprint, which is Montana. It was a line that line was specifically dedicated to carry wind up into Alberta. And it's operational now. So we did most of the construction financing. Once we were done with the construction, it went into commercial operation. Enbridge came in and paid off the loan, and they asset financed it going forward. So I think that is really kind of a great example of what the intent of this loan authority is. A couple years later, as opposed to most of the other Recovery Act programs that sunsetted, that expired, Congress then stepped back in and made our authority permanent. So they made it a part of our Hoover Act authority. And when they did that, they made it a permanent authority. But they also, one of the things that drew me to this program was when they did that, it essentially made it a revolving loan fund. If we have a permanent authority, I came in and helped restructure this authority into basically a revolving loan fund. So which is a good thing because these projects take a long time. From what I understand, there was some discussion this morning about how long these projects takes. But I have something to share with you, just our anecdotal observations about federal permitting and kind of what's really happening out there. So again, we can provide, we prefer to kind of stay into the early stage construction financing of the projects. The reason why is we actually have a very broad authority. We could do very long-term financings of large infrastructure. But really one of the things I did when I came in was sat down, and I do periodically sit down with all of the kind of very large institutional investors in infrastructure. And so I've sat down with JP Morgan, I've sat down with BlackRock, I've sat down with all of the all of the big infrastructure funds out there. And the consensus was, and we kind of revalidate this from time to time, but the consensus is the hardest money, the most expensive and hardest capital to get is actually development, but we can't do that. The next hardest is construction. Once you get these things up and running, I mean, they're poles and wires. And there's nothing, you know, there's not innovative technology. So everybody wants to do debt on those. So there's so much money out there to do long-term asset financing for these types of projects because they're just, all the risks gone. It's just operations and maintenance going forward. So the kind of the harder, most expensive financing is construction because you know, just construction is complex. Things can happen, and so that is really where our sweet spot is because not only do we have the funding, but we also can bring expertise and we know how to site, design, engineer, construct, own, and operate transmission in the West. So, so it was really a good marriage of kind of what our sweet spot is with, we can put money, I kind of call us kind of smart, we're smart money, particularly during the construction phase. And I think that is definitely the value that we bring to our partners. And in those cases where our partners want to do a project, and we can kind of find some either customer interest or some enterprise interest in the project where we can take maybe some kind of commercial interest in the project, we can also at that point potentially help them with rights of ways and other things that the government is very well positioned to do. So that is the project development side of this as well. We can assist. So here's kind of a good map of some of the projects there where we are involved in that we've either already up and operational or we are currently in development stage with all these projects. You'll see a lot of them are large interstate projects. But I find interesting, you know, again, kind of circle back to how long these projects take to site and permit. That is true, but I will also say that we have a lot of great stories about how a lot of these projects have been permitted. Stuck to schedule, no drama, they've happened. But those are the projects that don't necessarily sometimes make it to the news, right? It's usually the problem ones that have, you know, so that you often hear we've taken 10 years to site a transmission project. That does happen, but there's a lot of other background issues that happen to cause something to take that long. And I'll try to touch on that a little bit. But again, so we've got, you know, the Trans-West Express project, which is being, you know, the sponsor is the Anschutz Corporation, which Coloradans are familiar with the Anschutz. That's a 725 miles of high voltage transmission from Wyoming to California. And so we've been working, that one it took, I think, 7 years for us to get a record of decision on the environmental. We were co-agency lead with that project. It still does not have, because I think we came forward with our record of decision in January of this year. They're still working on trying to identify some commercial commitments to that project, but just to give you a sense of kind of ones that have taken a long time for permitting. The other ones that have taken a while, but actually kind of it wasn't too bad, was SunZia and with Southline transmission projects that go from seeking to bring wind from New Mexico across New Mexico into Arizona and hopefully sell that energy into Arizona and California. Southline I can speak to that. I think that took less than 5 years, like over 400 miles of high voltage transmission, kept to schedule, and that one's, you know, moving forward. SunZia is kind of the same situation, and so we have a lot of other projects. But I just want to give you the sense of kind of the magnitude of some of these projects, and that some of them, the good news is, some of them have gotten their records of decisions, the permitting is done, they're working on their state permits, they're working on their local county permits. The big question is, who's going to commit to these lines? Who's going to financially commit to these lines? Again, here's some of the projects that we have financed in the last year or two. We look at high voltage interstate transmission projects. We'll look at basically generation tie line type of project. So if we get a large, like in one instance, we're working with like a 3,000 megawatt build out of solar in San Joaquin Valley, and they need a fairly substantial generation tie line to gather that and then get that to where they need to get to marketplace, just as an example. We're also looking at energy storage, front of meter energy storage. So like, I think our sweet spot would probably be water pump storage. There are some of those out there that have just gotten their permits. The other is kind of very large scale battery storage. So I'll kind of end with, we've the last couple of years, I think in 2015, Congress passed the FAST Act. I can't remember what it all stands for. I can't remember what it stands for. I do have it listed here, so good. I'm glad I put it on. The Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. Although it says surface transportation, what it also did was it does cover transmission, electricity transmission. So what this act did in its Title 14, was establish a council, a federal permitting council, and essentially that council is comprised of the deputy secretaries of all the agencies that are affected by large infrastructure permitting. So throughout kind of 2015 and the better part of 16, they actually stood up the council, hired an executive director. We started working on guidance for other agencies and for potential projects to, how they would interact with this council. Really what this council does is it's aimed to try to kind of create some standardization in how the agencies interact with each other and how try to create some standardization to the degree it's possible, that when a project comes forward and it's got multiple agency interactions and is over $200 million, a project sponsor can come to the council and say, I want to apply, I want to become a covered project. And what essentially that does is it puts them on a dashboard, a public dashboard, which you can see now. The dashboard is live now. And what it forces everybody to do, sponsors, all the participating agencies, is to establish project milestone dates. And if the agencies don't meet their project milestone dates, then there's ways for the sponsor to kind of push that issue. There's an appeal. There's appeals. There's more of a stick to getting federal permitting timelines adhered to by all the agencies. And ultimately, I think if there is a issue between two agencies where they cannot come to some kind of agreement, there are processes they can go to CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality, and the White House OMB to resolve those, rather than kind of the agencies going back and forth and back and forth. And that's really, to be honest with you, that's what's put a lot of time on schedule. Having been co-agency lead on several of these projects, where you've got two agencies that are taking differing views of issues, and there wasn't kind of like a final arbiter. And so now this kind of creates a final arbiter. One of the recent updates with the Trump administration was the president signed an executive order just recently and essentially put more teeth into this process, and essentially said if you don't meet certain timelines, the specific agency that's not meeting their timelines and milestones are going to get hit on their budget. So that's going to be interesting to see. So all this is really, since it's been newly stood up, and the guidance and the regulations, everything is just starting to finally kind of take to coalesce, and they're starting to seek public comment. So while there's a lot going on here, I think there's still plenty of time for folks to weigh in on what they think, how this could better be rolled out going forward. So I would really keep a lot of attention, keep attention to this process if you're interested in kind of complex permitting. I'll just finish up. I think my time is up, right? I'll just finish up by just saying, there's the permitting. We can always improve on federal permitting and cooperation. I will say that my experience with a lot of the sponsors is the markets just have not coalesced. Really, what's going to drive these projects? My experience so far has not been the permitting. It has been off-takers, it has been utilities, or the eventual purchasers of large-scale renewables to make the financial commitments to buy it. And so that's really kind of what's, I think the good news, what I said earlier, is that a pile of these projects have went through years and years and are now permitted, and they're working through their final permitting. And once some of the rules get figured out on the state levels in the West, and utilities and folks started procuring, these are going to move really fast. So I think, a lot of hard work is going to be paying off here pretty soon. And I will just kind of leave it at that for now. So thank you very much.
All right, I'll sit there. So, hey, good afternoon, everybody. And for those of you students who are still here, congratulations. And if any of you are interested in internships at the California Energy Commission, come talk to me after this, because it's been a long day. I'm quite impressed. And we are always looking for people who are really into energy. So I'm Karen Douglas. I'm a commissioner at the California Energy Commission, and I'll talk a bit about siting. I'll talk a bit about California policy and some of the work that we're doing. And I'm going to start with climate policy. As a number of speakers have mentioned, California does have mandatory targets for reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. And in addition to having our own targets, we've been working initially with the German state of Baden-Württemberg, and then on an under-2 coalition of subnational and national and city governments committed to keeping temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius or below. This is the under-2 memorandum of understanding. This commitment has been signed by 188 governments representing or coming from 39 countries, 6 continents, and covering areas where 12 billion people live and about 39% of the global economy. So it's a serious movement. It would be, everybody in this room and wherever you're from can have a real part in this, because we really think leadership has to come from subnational levels, from every level, really. And so we've got these very aggressive climate goals. We're on track to meet the 2020 goals. We're very committed to meeting our 40% reductions. And we have, by executive order, a goal of 80% below 1990 levels. We've also got renewable energy laws that are very strong. And what's fun about it, in my spare time, I teach a renewable energy law class at the University of California in Davis. And it's fun because it changes about, each iteration of the renewable energy law lasts about 2 years. And the regulations implementing it sometimes even have a shorter shelf life. And so, it's 20% by 2017. No, wait, it's 20% by 2010. Whoops, no, 33% by 2020. Well, that's too easy. How about 50% by 2030? Well, okay, well, how about 100%? And by the way, we're going to electrify the transportation sector. And so, so the direction, the policy direction is really set. And while implementation has challenges, Melissa talked about an Oregon cluster. Well, there's certainly a California cluster or two in there. Implementation is hard, but when you know the direction, you can communicate very clearly with your colleagues in your own agency, with other agencies, with the public, with industry, and you can really kind of get down to, so how do we get this done? So let's see here. Yes. Things have changed on the ground. You know, sometimes you make big policy pronouncements, and you take pictures, and you sign orders, and everyone goes home, and nothing changes. Well, this picture kind of shows you a bit of what's changed. So green line on the bottom, biomass. We've had a lot of big biomass facilities since the PERPA days. Still got them. It's not really getting much bigger. Small hydro. We've had a dip in eligible production from small hydro because of the drought. We had a lot of rain recently, so much that we were not even running generators. We were pushing water out of those reservoirs as fast as it would go because of flood risk in the last year. You know, but pretty constant. Geothermal, pretty constant. Wind, wow. You see that starting to uptick around a little before 2010. It's purple. It's still the biggest band in the renewable energy makeup. But here comes solar out of nowhere. You know, the Bureau of Land Management did a big programmatic EIS for the West Mojave they did a big plan focusing on ground squirrel. In that plan, which was finished in the early part of the 2000s, utility scale solar was found not foreseeable in the West Mojave. Well, fast forward a couple years, the Bureau of Land Management and the Energy Commission and a bunch of other agencies are getting together on the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan because utility scale solar in the California desert is so widespread that we're starting to have significant concerns about where things could go with certain kinds of cumulative impacts and connectivity, and how do we maintain habitat and communicate to people who live in or care about the desert without a broader plan. Let's do a broader plan. So solar comes out of nowhere. It's the fastest growing slice now by far. So today California is at about 29% renewable energy. That doesn't count self-generation systems. So if you count self-generation systems, you get a lot more. And what you can see here, and kind of what I want to point out, is not so much the numbers, but it's the trajectory. It's the trajectory. It goes from small year-to-year increases to enormous. And this is not a cumulative chart. So don't think that 2007, represents an incremental increase from 2006. The 2007 number, the 2015, 2016, these are in that year, that much new capacity installed. So the increases of solar have been tremendous. And it's been utility scale. It's been sort of the medium size, 10, 20, 30 megawatt systems. It's been rooftop solar. It's been everything in between. It's been on commercial buildings, residential buildings, public lands, private lands, degraded ag land, less degraded ag land, unfortunately pretty good habitat, not so good habitat. It's been a very, in some ways someone said opportunistic or market-driven process. And the permitting process has not been easy. I'm going to turn around and focus for a moment on utility scale projects. There are some real issues that come up and have come up. I'm going to fast forward from this for a minute. So some of these projects, this is the Desert Sunlight Solar Project. It's the largest thin film solar project in the world, about 5 square miles. And so just from this picture, you can see, obviously 5 square miles is a lot of land. You're connected with some of the mountains. Well, what about hydrology? What about runoff? What about species from the valley, from the mountains, connectivity? And so even in relatively low impact areas, and I'd consider this one to be a reasonably lower impact project, you have real environmental issues to think about. Well, when you're clustering fairly large numbers of fairly large projects in areas with higher sensitivity, you can have issues. And if you add to the biological issues, well, there's hydrology, there's Native American cultural resources and cultural landscape, sacred sites. You've got a number of things to think about. This is the Ivanpah project, different technology. These are power towers. In addition to, so they're thermal energy. We had the solar flux issues with the power tower technology, but you know, it's an iconic project. It's one of the early ones that got through the joint state and federal permitting process. Geothermal, much less land intensive. This is the geysers, which is the largest developed geothermal field. We have a number of different facilities there. And the geysers, the environmental issues were a little different. You know, they're much more compact in terms of land, but in order to operate sustainably, there had to be some agreements with local water authorities because you have to replenish some of the water in the reservoir. Land, or wind, this is the Alta Wind Energy Center. I think it might be the largest of the new projects that came into California, certainly one of them. It's a real case study on local benefits of these projects. It brings in about $20 million a year to the local community in terms of certain kinds of benefits that go to farmers and environmental and other local benefits. That's in addition to about $30 million a year in property taxes and about $200 million of a one-time sales tax benefit. So, you know, really large benefits, potential impacts from these projects. I'm going to go back. Sorry about the quick movement here. So permitting was tough for a couple of reasons. Well, one is that while everyone wanted renewable energy and we knew that we needed renewable energy and we were in the middle of the recession of 2008. And so jobs and the Recovery Act were a really big deal. And yet California can sometimes make things challenging because we have a state law that parallels virtually every federal environmental law there is. And so it wasn't enough to say, okay, BLM, good luck, we want these projects. We actually had to show up because for the thermal projects, the California Energy Commission had jurisdiction too. If BLM said yes and the CEC said no, the answer was no. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife did its species review on projects, and there is a state Endangered Species Act, and it has broader coverage and it has a higher mitigation standard. It wasn't uncommon for some of these projects for BLM to require a 1-to-1 mitigation ratio and California to require 3-to-1. Mm-hmm. And so one of the biggest challenges, but let's just take this macro. So one of the biggest challenges is that if you have a state agency and a federal agency separately writing an environmental analysis of a project, and you will automatically, no matter what, no matter how good the state and federal staff are, there will be contradictions, there will be inconsistencies, there will be challenges that could, destroy both documents in court very easily if there's a challenge, and you have to think there could be. So the first thing we did was this Renewable Energy Action Team. We had the staffs of both of these agencies meet together, not once, not twice, not nice to know you, but literally weekly, sometimes daily. When project developers came in to raise concerns about the analysis or the timeline or the approach staff was taking or the mitigation that staff was asking for, they met with the state and federal agencies together. When it was and it saved a tremendous amount of time because so much mischief is caused when somebody comes in the room and says, well, I can't do what you want me to do because BLM told me to do that. And you go to BLM and you say, well, no, we didn't. Or they say, well, we did, but only because the developer said they were doing it. And so none of that. They met with the state and federal staff together. We produced joint analyses. And we actually, at the end of the day, split those analyses into separate CEQA and NEPA documents, but they were based on the same staff product. And so that was one of the ways that we learned to get through these projects when there was joint state-federal jurisdiction. The other way was the Renewable Energy Policy Group, where once a month or so, you had decision makers from not only the key agencies doing the analysis, but from the very important but not so central agencies. What about the Army Corps of Engineers? What about the Department of Defense or the bases that might be affected by certain projects or by the analyses? And what about the state water board? What about a regional water board? US EPA. There were so many agencies that held the key to some little part of an analysis. Well, when you have them all in the same room with the governor's office, with the Department of Interior, heads of agencies, it was conversations that could have taken weeks or months to resolve, got to bottom lines pretty quickly. Why is the CEC requiring this? Well, we're not. We're requiring that. Oh, well, why are you saying that you can't do this until FERC does that? Well, because of this. Well, okay, and so it didn't always solve the problem right away, but it created a process to solve problems and communication, and it's really essential. So the other thing we did together was work on the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which also touched off other landscape planning efforts. So going back to the California desert for a minute, there are two really iconic types of landscapes in California. I mean, people care about all sorts of environmental and conservation landscapes, but the coast, don't touch it. Oh, very careful, very careful. I actually work with, and it's one of the things on the list here, planning around offshore wind. Well, that's come up more recently. It's an intriguing resource. The Energy Commission and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management have been working together on outreach, but when BOEM first reached out to us to talk about offshore wind, we said, okay, but let's work in a really, really, really long time to go talk to a lot of people and have a lot of outreach and some very good science and planning, because the coast is very, 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 very important to people. Well, so is the desert. If you live in Los Angeles, you might be surrounded by houses. You might have to deal with, difficult air quality and miserable traffic, but you know that you can get in your car and you can drive east, and pretty soon you'll be in landscapes that look virtually untouched. You can go to places where you won't see another human being for, the day or multiple days, unless you see, Top Gun flying over your head, and that's kind of cool too. And so the desert is a really special landscape for people in California. And as we saw these projects come in, it was an interesting moment for a lot of California environmental groups and environmental advocates, because, we've been arguing for and fighting for these strong renewable energy and climate policies, and here they are, and here come the projects. And well, how long do we have to study this? And are how much mitigation should we require? What does that do to costs? What does that do to timelines? Do you oppose a project because of the potential impact on Mojave ground squirrel? Should a wind turbine ever be permitted in an area where it could kill a condor? Ever? Or not? Or what should happen if a wind turbine were to kill a condor? And so you're suddenly facing this discussion that threatened to, and occasionally has, burst into this kind of green on green dynamic. And it took a lot of leadership on the part of industry and the environmental community to and with the state and federal agencies to say, you know what, we're not going to slow down project permitting. We're going to permit projects, so they'll move through our process. They're not guaranteed a yes, but they're guaranteed a timely answer. But we're going to do this planning. And so we started in the desert. It was a 22.5 million acre area that we looked at. It took 8 years. We got 16,000 comment letters. We scaled back the formal action. At the end only applied to BLM land, but we worked extensively with 6 counties that are all wrapping this work into their local planning. Huge effort. We worked with many, many tribes. It was, and so that's one way of trying to balance some of this. Here's the plant area. I don't need to explain the map unless you guys want to see it. I'm going to bounce around for a moment to distributed generation, just to say that I think this picture is from Lancaster. We have a few cities. Lancaster is the first of them that now require photovoltaic on all new buildings. I think you'll see more of that, and I think you'll see that become a state requirement before too long. And let's see, I was going to say something else, but I think I won't to leave time for questions. You know what, I'm sorry. I'm going to say one more thing. Sorry. So one of the things we have to do is look forward. We talked about planning. One of our big challenges as we look forward is the impacts of climate change on our energy system. So, you know, we're changing our energy system to help address and help mitigate climate change. Well, you know, we're seeing, we're pretty water resilient. We're used to droughts, so we've had tight water requirements on power plants. In the last drought, as bad as it was, you know, it didn't threaten reliability, even though we barely had hydro, and even though we struggled, but we managed pretty well. But the fires, oh boy, transmission and fires, and you see the tremendous vulnerability there. The move towards more distributed or dispersed generation, the move to smart grid, smart controls, I think is going to have real dividends for California and for many really Western regions. This fire cycle is a very Western phenomenon augmented by climate change. So I think there are, we need to think ahead. We need to think about impacts of climate change on our system and how we build in resiliency. And with that, thank you.
I'm sure Karen and I get an award for being the last one standing, right? No, but only
right.
for a few more minutes.
The others.
Then I have to leave too.
And I think we have a few minutes for questions. I also want to say, though, that the woman who is responsible for the Trans-West Express was a CU grad. She was one of my students when we were here. So we should have had her here, too, next time. So wonderful panels. These last questions, yeah.
I think I'm going to give our students a break and just ask a quick question here. It's the end of the day, and I appreciate you staying. So I'll stand in for the students if I could. So last year for our Schultz lecture, which Colette Honorable delivered last night, we had the eminent economist Paul Joskow. And he came and put up a series of slides that had my students running to me afterwards, almost in tears, because it was a little bit depressing in the sense that he put up these projections from the Energy Information Agency that were out to about 2040, and they had all the scenarios about what our fuel mix would look like in the electricity sector, and they had the Clean Power Plan scenario, they had a Clean Power Plan Plus scenario, and then they had the no Clean Power Plan scenario. And his point was that in all of them, we still relied to a significant extent on fossil-fired fuel, especially natural gas. And so I think the message was we need to have this sort of all of the above idea. But the message that I get from your panel today, from all of the panelists in some way or another, is both we must think differently from that, and also that we can, and in some cases we are, right, thinking differently. So I guess my question to our remaining panelists is why? Why should we be more optimistic than that slide from the EIA?
So
Go ahead.
I'll start because, you know, I have my moments of optimism and my moments of pessimism, but I'll tell you the optimistic side of it. You know, first of all, we can control our destiny here. The energy decisions are made locally and at a state level. You know, President Trump can talk all he wants about coal. It's very often an economic decision. It should be you know, I mean, I think there should be a greenhouse gas part of it, but even if it's just an economic decision, coal loses. And gas increasingly is losing. And when you get to disruptive technology, truly disruptive technology, when something comes out that is just flat better, it's cheaper, and everyone wants it. You know, you don't have to make people buy iPhones. They buy them because they, you know, want them. Not that there aren't competitives, and you know, people have Androids too, and they're wonderful. But people want, you know, the same is going to be true very soon of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are already better cars. They have wonderful performance characteristics. Now they need to get better with range. We need to build the infrastructure. Are there barriers? Yes, there are barriers. But I think we win. You know, we need places like California, and California is not alone, thank God, because we're not enough. We need places that will take leadership and take on some cost where we need to, and will put energy and effort into incubating technologies and into being first movers and into getting things out. But what I see that makes me optimistic is that the products that are going to solve or help solve our climate crisis are better products. I don't have to go around the world convincing people that they should ban the better light bulb, because the better light bulb is the LED. And when California banned incandescent light bulbs, it was barely a whimper, because people don't want them anymore. So that's where optimism comes in. I can tell you about pessimism, but I won't.
Well, I'm an optimist by trade. So I would say that I'm optimistic because of separation of powers, federalism, and our amazing country that has a diverse public-private hybrid. So what do I mean by that? Well, because every time we see something depressing from one branch, then another branch will kind of step in and provide a balance of powers that we see sometimes in, you know, it's not always a one-to-one, but we've definitely seen the court stepping in to sort of temper some of the activities that are going on to date. On a federalism level, when we see the federal government step back, right, we see the states fill the void, right? But it worked the converse way earlier, right? The whole reason the federal government got involved was because some states weren't doing enough, and so then the Fed stepped in. And then, right, the public-private balance we have is that similarly we thought maybe public regulation was the way to go, but I have been heartened of recent days just seeing all these announcements from all these auto manufacturers about fleets of 20 new electric vehicle models. I mean, how quickly this is changing, that commitments voluntarily through private governance, that they're getting together and seeing what Karen's talking about, that there is demand for this, so we're going to provide it, and commitments to say we're not going to manufacture any more internal combustion engine vehicles by certain dates is, if we had talked about that 4 years ago, you would have all thought we were insane. That will never happen. The big three will never do that. So I think you have to have more confidence in our ability to adapt and do so in amazing ways.
And I'm going to say one more thing, because the other reason for optimism is I don't wake up every morning thinking, oh my God, California's doing it, and if we don't do it, the world ends. Because we have so much leadership all over the country and the world, but we have China. And to think that even 5 years ago, it would have been inconceivable to say that the reason I'm optimistic about the fate of the world is China. But they are shuttering coal at an astonishing rate. They are deploying electric vehicles at an incredible rate. They've got a 1 gigawatt offshore wind goal. They're putting solar out faster than California can even think about it. And we're putting it out pretty fast. And so, you know, these market dynamics of innovating and getting to scale and learning how to build affordably better products, the Chinese are really good at that. And, you know, California sends delegations to China frequently. And we've learned a lot from it. And a lot of the time, we'll come back, you know, our people will come back from that trip and they'll say, yeah, I don't think we need to worry about the EVs being affordable. I think they'll be there. You know, we hope our auto companies get in the game, because it would be a shame if they didn't, but we think we'll have cars to buy. So that's part of it too.
And I want to just add one thing, that IEA is notoriously wrong about their predictions, just as some of the charts we had showed. And that electric vehicles are better, you know, so fleets are going to want them because they last longer. Question?
Hi, I just wanted to say thanks again for being here and being the last two standing. I guess my question is, so with the new solar tariffs for out-of-state solar panels coming into the U.S., I was just wondering how you think that's going to affect not only distributed generation, but just utility-scale solar development and the energy transition in general here in the U.S.
Do you want to start, or do you want?
Go ahead. I mean,
you know,
sad.
Okay. You know, it's depressing and it's obnoxious. I think of it as, you know, it will cost California ratepayers. There's no question about it. It will raise our costs, and I don't, you know, on the other hand, I don't think it is sufficient to change any of the underlying dynamics. I think that if tariffs succeeded in pushing manufacturing to the U.S., we could actually do it, and the cost would go up, but they wouldn't go up to what panels cost a year ago. I mean, the price trajectory is sharply and rapidly down, and so I don't think I think it is not helpful. But I don't think it has the power to upend what we're doing. And even if it disrupts the North American or the U.S. market for some period of time, you know, California won't like it. We'll be really upset. But it won't be a blip in the world production of solar panels because China's using many of the panels they're making. Other people will get the panels for less.
Two things that are going to be very important in the future is the raw earth elements that are used as that could have a major environmental impact on the solar industry, and the degradation of the arrays and the BOS components that are used, the rackings and so forth. Besides the silicone, the life cycle is only about 20 years, and we're going to have an environmental impact just by raw materials that are going to have to be disposed of, because the majority of them can't be recycled. And Columbia University did a very good report this past year regarding the strategic raw elements that are used. And there could be a geopolitical dynamic, well, not so much a dynamic, a calamity between countries, because China controls the raw earth elements for a lot of the materials that go into the BOS components and, of course, the silicone. And those are issues that nobody's addressing in this ramp up of solar energy. And I'm a green advocate, totally, particularly supply chains, sustainable supply chains, and the usage of it. But those are areas that the industry is not looking at right now that are really going to come home to haunt us, I believe.
Yeah, you know, those are issues that we need to look at. I mean, when we permit solar, of course, we look at what happens when a project's done and disposal. I mean, we have had solar panels last longer than 20 years. It's pretty standard for solar panels to last pretty well, even under very difficult conditions. That doesn't take away the point that both the panels themselves and batteries that are used as backup will present disposal issues of various kinds, and in some cases, recycling may be an option. In some cases, they won't. Solar panels are not monolithic. Companies are using a number of different materials and a number of different technologies, some of which will prove to be better than others. I think it's a real issue and one that we need to keep an eye on. But I also think it's something that we'll have to manage. I mean, our alternatives, our fossil alternatives, have geopolitical issues too, as we all know, and we just, you know, eyes wide open that we need to understand and keep an eye on that. But yeah,
my son's an electrical engineer, and he's worked at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and a lot of the rare earths are not in the panels that are the main ones that they're using now. So, and there are actually a lot of rare earths in the United States. It's just a very dirty process. But you can, you know, use the 1872 mining law. There are claims out there to, you know, to get them. It's just in the United States, the process has been too difficult because it is very polluting process. So.
poor public lands. So.
Yeah, right. In California, they've been trying to bring them up.
They've also been trying to get lithium out of the Salton Sea brine, and I'm cheering that on.
And I haven't seen your Columbia study, but I know that the National Renewable Energy Lab has done studies. The National Renewable Energy Lab has done studies that we have enough. So I'm not sure. I haven't compared these two. Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that China has a stranglehold on it right now. Sachs? No. Okay. Oh, at Cornell.
So we are actually technically out of time, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and thank you all for giving so much of your time today to join us for this conference, and I hope that you will stay in touch with our program, with DU Law's program, and other efforts around energy programming for lawyers and regulators. We do not have an official reception this afternoon, but you should feel free to stay. I'll be here for a few minutes. Maybe our panelists, if they have a couple minutes, will stick around, but thank you again, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you to all of you.
And a big thank you to Commissioner Douglas and Professor DeVivier as well, and all the other panelists in absentia.